I'm here to chat with Alex Steele about the parallels between leadership in an organisation or a business and in the world of jazz. Alex is both a jazz musician and an academic, so has an interesting perspective on both. My assumption is you've got to be pretty aware of each other as you're playing. It's no good kind of shutting your eyes and going into some dream world of your own music.
If there are four of us in the band, we have to be fully present and in the moment all the time, as we should in every conversation that we have. But as we know, in reality, we can be distracted. If you're in a jazz group and you get distracted, then the sound, the collective sound, can actually start to fall apart. So we have to be listening very, very deeply.
And that's really interesting in terms of organisations, because how much of the time do people actually listen? My experience is not very often. You know, we've got one ear on what's being said, and we've got another ear on what we're overhearing outside. We've got a third ear wondering what's going on with my iPhone, and another one looking at something on the table.
And the fifth ear is saying, I'm listening to this conversation, kind of, but I want to say something really important. So I'm just waiting for my time to say this really amazing thing.
If you've organised the gig, for example, does that make you a sort of nominal leader? So you would kind of give the nod and...
I think maybe the leader only in terms of the logistics. I've arranged the gig. But when we start playing the music, then the leadership function will only be mine when I'm playing a piano solo. At some time in the piece of music, a guitar or a saxophone will take the lead and they become the leader. And when that happens, again, it's not predictable, because there just comes a time when it feels that I should pass the leadership baton to someone else, and they pick up that challenge, normally with just a nod of their heads. In the book, you talk about zones of choice. And one of the themes is about self-belief, where you talk about this paradox of being strong and also admitting to your vulnerabilities. Again, this is what I'm reading in your book, but I feel it as a musician, is that you have to be strong and confident in your own ability, but you also have to acknowledge that you have maybe some areas of weakness that need to be improved upon. In a conversation, a musical conversation, we'll be feeling strong and confident and we know what's happening, but it's a complex conversation. You then may feel quite vulnerable and exposed.
By being authentic and demonstrating that vulnerability, the emotion in that enables someone else to collect you and pick you up almost in a musical sense, I guess, in terms of if you're wandering off in the wrong direction, someone will kind of wander after you and help you back on track.
Yeah, that's a good point. And again, it reminds me of, from the book, this reference to generosity. So it's about seeking help when needed, but offering help as well when you see others need it. And there is a generosity of spirit within the jazz group in that we want each other to be good collectively. If you're the drummer, I want you to sound as good as you can be. And does that happen in a team where you can see one person is flagging a bit? I guess it depends on the culture of the organisation and the people involved. In some worlds, you know, the weak member may be discarded and not cared for. Well, if we're in the moment and on stage and we've got, 600 people watching us, we certainly have a vested interest in making sure that we look after each other and we're generous.
A jazz musician has no interest at all in looking absolutely brilliant personally in a poor overall performance. There's no advantage to that, is there? You want everybody to succeed. You want to succeed individually, so you want your solo to kind of stand out and be good, but you want everyone else to be good as well. I think that's what happens in the best teams, actually. People have this shared sense of responsibility. Yeah, I want to do a good job and I want recognition for that, but it's equally important to me that everyone else succeeds.
Yes, well, quite right. And particularly if you want to get booked again.
You want another job.
The jazz club.
And it's interesting, isn't it? That's also true in the world of work, actually. If we just kind of make the comparison, you want another gig? Well, you better do a good job collectively, otherwise you'll be out.
Yeah, exactly right.
And I guess in the jazz environment, there'd be quite a lot of freedom. There is a structure. You're playing in a particular key, and you've probably got some chord sequence in the back of your mind. But above and beyond that, there's a lot of freedom.
Even though we're mostly operating in the moment, there are things that we do in the moment that create alternative futures. And if this is to do with product design,
so that's the link between the here and the future almost. It's not they're two separate things. It's one emerges from
being in the moment, but in a more disruptive way. Again, it's a little bit paradoxical. People often phone me up and say, "Hi, Alex, we'd like you to play jazz at our birthday party or wedding." And I say, "Okay, what kind of jazz do you like?" And it tends to be kind of decade specific. And this is the interesting thing. So there's jazz of the 1920s and the 30s and the 40s and the 50s. It does reinvent itself every decade. There's always a different sound that happens, even though it's all still called jazz. And that's this thing about innovation and disruption within the genre itself, not just within one song, but the whole art form continues to adapt and to change all through time, which of course is the way the industry works. But we just have to be careful about how far we push people, because I think it feels uncomfortable to the listener.
This is interesting to explore in terms of how do you get your ideas accepted? How do you make it easier for people to understand? And I think it's an interesting parallel with the solo, where you actually need to start where people are and gradually take them to something that's kind of radical and different. And because you're taking them on a bit of a journey with you, when you get there, they say, oh, I see, that's where that might fit in, and we might be able to adapt this to that and the other.
That rings true to me in both of those ways. So within a piece, you're bringing your musicians and the listeners with you. But over time, there were a string of great innovators in jazz that have changed what jazz is as a language, the way it's put together. So everyone talks about Miles Davis and John Coltrane and Bill Evans and many others, from the 60s onwards.
So they would even challenge the underlying structure and said,
well,
we don't have to play in the same key, we can change halfway through, or we can play in an odd tempo. And everyone would have said, but you can't do that.
The great Ornette Coleman, he was very controversial in his time. And even I still listen to him now and go, wow, what? It's quite challenging. There are others who've persevered, and they know this disruption, this innovation is uncomfortable, not really for them, but for those around them, the Mavericks. And yet they have such self-belief and self-confidence that they stick with it because they want to demonstrate to the world around them that this thing has value. And so Miles and Monk and Coltrane and so on, they did this, and jazz musicians to this very day continue to do it. And it makes some of the audience a little bit unhappy. And I think Miles Davis himself said, he'd often go to gigs. He was one that changed his own sound every decade. And he'd go to the concert and people would say, can you play that song from that album in 1959? And he said, no, that's what I did then, and now I've got another thing, and I want you to hear that instead. I guess as jazz musicians, we do that live and in the moments.
You're pretty much out there as a jazz musician, and you have your internal measure of success or failure. You know whether you've played a good gig or not. Ultimately, it's the audience who are the judge. So you're kind of very exposed there, aren't you? And you kind of, if people start throwing rotten fruit at you or booing or whistling, that's pretty challenging. And in a way, I think leadership's a bit like that. You're kind of out there on your own to a certain extent. It's another of these paradoxes of, I've got to have the confidence to believe in what I'm doing, and I must be making sure that I'm getting feedback and that it's connecting with people.
Yeah.
But you can't just follow. You have to lead. You have to kind of
That's right.
take the initiative sometimes. And it can feel a bit exposed, just like, I guess, being a jazz musician.
Some people may be critical of jazz in that they say, oh, you guys just play for yourselves, and it doesn't matter what the audience is thinking. You're just having fun, aren't you? And there are different schools of thought about that. I think some pure artists, whatever the art form is, might be saying, yeah, I'm doing this because I'm expressing myself. Yeah. And if it was an artist and everyone else hated this stuff, I guess there's some value in this thing. But as a business, it's not going to be very good because you're not going to sell any paintings. When I'm performing collectively or as a solo musician, it's very important, that connection with the audience. And one of the themes of the Zones of Choice is about relationships, isn't it? It's about getting close whilst maintaining your distance. I think that makes sense as a leader.
Theme there, isn't it? Yeah.
Although I would say that for jazz, within the jazz group, we have to stay close all the time. I'm not sure it's actually possible to maintain a distance.